governments stand back and go, we didn't do anything here. This is the problem and the arrogance of it all. And often it's the case where the other guy is blamed for something that our own government has done. In fact, if you look at environmental issues generally, virtually all the Superfund sites, 90% of them, are government sites where the government made the mess, and then the rest of us get to clean it up. Now we're experimenting with science that's much, much different than leaving a mess in some local location on the ground. We're manipulating the entire geophysical systems of the planet and trying to learn how to do it better, how to dial it up a little more efficiently, how to control those outcomes with a more precision and a more higher resolution as our science advances. We've written the book Controlling the Human Mind, and we wrote and produced the video Mind Control, which Alex has carried for years. And I always consider that the most important work. Even when you associate some of the mind effects things with HAARP, they're big and they're important. But as we got more into that subject, it became, for me, the most compelling and important work that we've published. Because the idea of interfering with human consciousness, this idea of being able to interfere with free will, if you will, something that even God will not do in most religious traditions, interfere with free will, is now within the capability of man. Should man do it? I say absolutely not. Again, thinking about personal liberty and personal freedom, the basic premise of the First Amendment of the Constitution, the right of free speech, the right of assembly, the right of free expression of religion, all of those presuppose a fundamental right, the freedom to think. That's the First Amendment, because it presupposes all of that. Without the freedom to think, none of the other liberties matter at all. And this is the century that we're in. The CIA, actually the work in this goes before the CIA. You go back to the work at Harvard, work being done at the hypnotherapy labs at Harvard in the 1920s by a guy named Estabrook. And Estabrook had this idea that you could create what we would call today the Manchurian candidate, some super spy that would be pre-programmed to do destruction or gather intelligence, and if captured would have absolutely no knowledge of any of it. Well, he started this work in the 20s. By the 1930s, his work was classified. By the 1960s, the material he had published, he acknowledged that he created these super spies, that he spent 9 to 10 months, and 1 out of 5 people were subject to this level of programming, where he would subject them to 9 to 10 months of programming where he literally split the personality into 2 separate human beings within the same body, programming one to be the super spy where they could function in another country without detection, and if captured would have no memory of their true self. And yet when they returned to the United States, this altered consciousness could be re-triggered to remember everything they collected in the foreign country and their true self. The problem is you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Once you fracture a human being in this way, you've effectively destroyed them forever. He believed this was a good idea, and he advanced this technology. And the same material that he published advancing the idea that using LSD to alter people's consciousness for mind control experiments was legitimized and reasonable and a good thing. That's what he wrote in his published work. At the same time, the Central Intelligence Agency later was revealed to be experimenting with LSD on 8,000 men and women in the armed services alone, not to mention the civilian sector. This came out in a congressional report that was on activities within the CIA right after Watergate. When, remember Watergate, there's ex-CIA operatives breaking into this building for the bagmen of the Nixon administration. Well, there are no ex-CIA guys, number one, unless they're dead. And number two, the fact is when they got caught, what they got caught doing were mind control experiments. The church committees and the Congress actually heard the testimony as the CIA busied themselves shredding the documents because they acknowledged over 140 programs under MK Ultra and its sub-programs that were directly involved in the manipulation of human behavior using chemical means and electromagnetic means. And one of the organizations they worked through at the time was the Mankind Research Association, operated out of Bethesda, Maryland, which was a front for Navy intelligence organizations and the Central Intelligence Organization, developing mind control technologies and an understanding of what those would be about. More than a Manchurian candidate, manipulating people over huge geographic areas for very specific outcomes. At the same time, they were engaged in a great deal of research on what they called paraphysics, or parapsychology, or ESP in those days. A number of those reports prepared as far as our analysis of Eastern Europe that were eventually released under Freedom of Information Act are posted on our website. And you can go and look there and you'll see hundreds of pages of these declassified documents. They're heavily redacted, I mean lots blacked out, but you get a general sense of what we were doing. And here's what they discovered. And it's not in the published work. It's not in the other videos. It's not in that material. But here's the conclusions after all of it. And I met the Northwest Field Director, got to know him real well over the years, of the Mankind Research Association, the kind of stuff they were doing back in the 70s. And he kept his data. He's got a great box of data talking about all of these experimentations. And what they concluded was that A, extrasensory perceptions, these odd little things that people could do, were real. Not in all instances, but in enough instances to cause them some alarm, military planners. Because what also they discovered is that human beings generally have these innate capabilities that we used to call extrasensory perception. Some have referred to as gifts of the spirit. They come by a lot of different names. But what they are is natural attributes of what human beings are. We're created in the image of a creator. That means more than how we look. It has to do with what we are. And what we are very capable individuals. But in order to reach those higher capabilities, in order to reach those higher states of awareness, in order to actualize your full potential as a human being, you have to be able to slow the mind. You have to be able to create a situation where the mind, if you were to look at it with an EEG and look at the brain activity, you get very coherent, very rhythmic patterns, the kind associated with the emotions of love and empathy and compassion. Same kind of patterns show up. Higher ordered thinking is associated with these coherent patterns, these rhythmic patterns. Fear, flight responses, anger, hate, you get incoherent patterns all over the map at a higher amplitude, at a higher pulse rate, that indicate agitation, confusion, the inability to think. What we do know is that in states of fear, worry, and anxiety, you cannot ever reach your higher capacity as a human being. So the easiest mind control technique, keep people in a state of fear and worry and agitation, and we're defeated before the first volley is fired. That's not what we need to be about. You know, when you think about it, when you're walking confidently, consciously doing what you know you're capable of doing, how empowering it is to step into each act that you take on as a human being in a productive and meaningful way, without fear, without worry. It's when your mind falls into what some call that zone that the athlete knows and the artist knows and every one of us knows in those instances where those sparks of creativity come through. That is our normal state of consciousness. If you were to look at it in the lower range of the alpha range where you are in that most creative mindset, you'd be between 7 and 8, 7 and 9 hertz pulses per second. The planet naturally oscillates at 7.83 hertz pulses per second. Isn't that interesting? Correlates perfectly with the ideal state for awake, conscious living when you're awake. And yet the fields that we surround ourselves with in this room right now, in every room where everyone's watching this because the power grid is operating at 60 hertz, 60 pulses per second, an agitating signal all the time in our background noise, if you will, our noise. Because think about it in a crowded room, all the noise you hear and you're having a conversation with your friend, and you block out all that background noise. We do the same thing with electromagnetic fields. I'll tell you when you notice it. I couldn't use this analogy in Germany. I'll tell you why in a minute. But think about when the power fails in your community. When the power goes out, completely goes out, the power grid's down. Now everybody remembers it given all the winter storm activity. And the first thing you notice how quiet it is, because the refrigerator's not humming along, the air conditioner or the heaters aren't blowing air around. The second thing you notice is how your whole body exhales as you relax. Same feeling when you come in from a hard day of work and you're wearing your insulated soles on your shoes, and the first thing you do is you kick them off and you come back into ground with the pulse rate of the planet and you relax. That relaxation is the silence. Do you know what the sound of being born into an explosion is? Silence. We're living in that explosion, in the fields that surround us every moment of every day. When I used that analogy this last year in Stuttgart, everybody looked at me like I was crazy when I said, you know, when the power fails. It never fails in Germany. People with gray hair never remember a power failure since World War II ended. You know, I mean, we don't even think about that. I mean, you talk about the contrast in technology. I can't even use the same analogy in Europe because it doesn't make sense because their technology happens to run smoother. And we invented the power grid for all practical purposes. But again, you know, I say it humorously, but at the same time recognizing under all this are these very real effects that we have to recognize. So how do you learn how to control you? You know, people ask me all the time, you know, you talk about a lot of technologies generate a lot of concern, some levels of anxiety. That's not my intention. My intention is to inform so we can begin to think about this stuff in a productive, constructive way and how we address it. But more importantly, the more important part of this message, and anything that I've said in the last couple of days, is about the fact that we are more than we think we are. There are no small things. There's only things that are undone. Each thing that we do as individuals matters. It matters a lot, more than you might even realize or recognize. And there are no small things. And what I do versus what you do, it's not a size issue. It's getting the work done. All of us have a sphere of influence, and we need to assert ourselves in that sphere of influence. What that means is it might mean that we have a conversation with our family or our close friends. We don't feel any anxiety having done that. When the anxiety creeps in, back off. Think about what you're doing. It should be like breathe and stand back and go, we didn't do anything here. This is the problem and the arrogance of it all. And often it's the case where the other guy is blamed for something that our own government has done. In fact, if you look at environmental issues generally, you know, virtually all the Superfund sites, 90% of them, are government sites, where the government made the mess, and then the rest of us get to clean it up. Now we're experimenting First Amendment to the Constitution, the right of free speech, the right of assembly, the right of free expression of religion. All of those presuppose a fundamental right, the freedom to think. That's the First Amendment, because it presupposes all of that. Without the freedom to think, none of the other liberties matter at all. And this is the century that we're in. The CIA, actually the work in this goes before the CIA. You go back to the work. We've written the book Controlling the Human Mind, and we wrote and produced the video Mind Control, which Alex has carried for years. And I always consider that the most important work. Even when you associate some of the mind effects things with HARP, they're big and they're important. But as we got more into that subject, it became, for me, the most compelling and important work that we've published. Because the idea of interfering with human consciousness, this idea of being able to interfere with free will, if you will, something that even God will not do in most religious traditions, interfere with free will, is now within the capability of man. Should man do it? I say absolutely not. Again, thinking about personal liberty and personal freedom, the basic premise of the thing with science, That's much, much different than leaving a mess in some local location on the ground. We're manipulating the entire geophysical systems of the planet and trying to learn how to do it better, how to dial it up a little more efficiently, how to control those outcomes with a more precision and a more higher resolution as our science advances.